Hello, my name is Mary. And because it's such a popular name, I'm called Mary of Magdalene because I was born in the small town of Magdala. Magdala is a fishing town, about 3 kilometers up the coast from Capernaum, Galilee. It's a fishing town, but it also has a fabric industry and dye houses, and my parents have owned a dye house there for years. But all the money in the world did not help me when I was younger, for I suffered from severe afflictions. I'd be thrown on the floor in violent fits that I could not control. And periods of insanity would come upon me where I suffered from deep, dark despair, absolute sense of no self-worth at all, and sadness and loss. And nobody could help me. When I was a young woman, my parents heard tell of this new man of God. He was traveling from village to village and healing the sick everywhere he went, regardless of their affliction. So when he was in our area, they took me to him. And I don't really remember much except this walking along the road with this deep sense of absolute lost hopelessness, a bitter anger inside my mind, and a pain in my soul. My parents told me that Jesus simply reached out his hand and he put it on my head, and he told the 7 demons that had afflicted me to leave. All I know is this deep, heavy weight lifted off my chest, and for the first time that I could remember, I felt light and free, and I opened my eyes and I saw him, Jesus. I can't even get the words to describe what that was like. Even his stance just said compassion, and his eyes were alive with a deep and fierce love. His hand on my head, blessing me, so gentle. My parents thanked him with tears pouring down their faces, and they took me home. And they hugged me, and they held me, and they spoiled me, and they loved me. And I felt like I was walking on a cloud. That night when I went to bed, I lay down to sleep without a fear of falling asleep for the first time that I could ever remember. I was totally at peace, and I fell asleep into the deepest, most tranquil sleep of my life. When I woke up the next morning, I wanted to see Jesus again. I wanted to thank him, but I also wanted to know more. I wanted to understand him. When I told my parents, they said, of course, and my brother came with me. It was very easy to find Jesus. You just followed the crowd. Everyone was jostling to get as close as possible. And then everyone sank onto that sun-baked ground with the hard sand beneath our legs. The rustling of skirts stopped. The shh stopped. And then Jesus stood. And he spoke. He spoke of God's love. He spoke scripture that came alive in my very heart. And as I sat there with the sun baking down on my head, the crowd pressing in around me, the hard sand beneath my heels, I just knew a day of listening wasn't enough. A week wasn't going to be enough. I wanted to devote a lifetime to hearing what this man said, to understanding him, not just because he had healed me from such torment, but because there was something different. Somehow he really had the hand of God upon him. I went home with my brother and I told my parents, and they were so supportive. They were so pleased to have me in health that they agreed. And they said that my brother would periodically check in on us and bring with him some food and clothes and money to support us. And so the next morning, with a bag over my shoulder, with my few belongings, some food and some coins, I went to join the band, the disciples who travelled everywhere with Jesus. Those 2 years, nearly 2 years that I spent with Jesus were just unbelievable. We walked everywhere. There were a group of about 12, 14 men generally, and then there were some women with me who just accompanied Jesus as followers. Suzanne and Joanna became my absolute dearest friends. And everywhere we walked, Jesus would share his knowledge. He would talk to us about the love of God. He would tell us stories and parables. He would ask us deep questions that made you think. and I cherished it. I was so fortunate to be one of them. They say if you really want to get to know people, travel with them, and it's true. In that time, I got to know Jesus. And he was never, ever different. He was unfailingly loving, always just, always kind, always beyond generous, always praying. Every day he would find time just to get with God and pray. And in a society that treated women as a little bit less than, treated us with dignity, respect, equality. Just incredible. I got to know all the disciples too. I loved Peter, the rough fisherman, who was so quick to lose his temper, but so passionately following Jesus. And his kind brother Andrew. Then there was Philip, always asking questions. And of course the politically ambitious Judas, who controlled all the finances. In those 2 years, how do I describe what I saw? I learned so much. But I saw Jesus heal the lame, heal the blind. I saw demons leave other people. I saw the most incredible miracles happen. Jesus' love for people, his passion for the sick and the elderly and the children, is just unsurpassed. His strength was amazing. Even when he was absolutely exhausted, he still somehow found the strength to reach out to more pleading hands, more begging for help, more begging for answers. And then he would go off and pray. It was just an incredible 2 years. But he was also a very controversial man. He spoke the truth, regardless of who was listening or who it would offend. And that included against the priests and the Pharisees, who stood between God and man. I was there the day he went into the temple and threw out the moneylenders. His righteousness was like a burning flame that destroyed the greed before him. So he was controversial, he was challenging. And this story really gets going just before Passover. It was about 6 days before Passover, to be exact. And we were heading towards Jerusalem because Passover is an incredible celebration where all the Jews unite together to celebrate what God has done before for us. And this Passover was no exception. We were heading there. We went on the way through past Lazarus and Mary and Martha's home, and their welcome was always all-encompassing. I had been there when Mary and Martha had run to Jesus, weeping over the death of their brother. And Jesus wept with them, his compassion so real. And then I was there when he called Lazarus to come forth from his tomb, and still wrapped in his burial wrappings he had. Something so powerful, I will never forget that moment. And this evening was marked by something different too. We had seated and eaten supper when Mary, the younger sister, came in. And in front of everybody, she brought an alabaster jar filled with fragrance from India. And as she broke it open and that beautiful smell filled the room, she bent down and lavishly poured it over Jesus' feet. And then she took her own beautiful long hair and wiped them. I watched in silence. There was such a reverential awe about the act. It was really moving. Of course, old Moneybags Judas had something to say, and he said she should have kept the money and could have kept the perfume, and she could have sold it and used that money for the poor. But Jesus had looked at him with his calm eyes and said, "No, this oil is for my burial, and the poor will always be with you, or I will not." And something inside my heart went cold. It wasn't the first time Jesus had said that he wouldn't always be with us. But I couldn't imagine a life without him, a life without his teaching, his wisdom, his love. So I pushed the emotion aside and the thought away, and we carried on with our preparations. And the next day we continued with our journey. We went through Bethphage, and there the disciples went and got a colt for Jesus to ride. They put their own coats on. And we walked behind as he came into Jerusalem, And people had heard he was coming, and the streets were lined with the shouting crowd. And the mood was very volatile and excited, almost a frenzy, as they ripped off palm leaves and raised them up and down and hailed him as King of the Jews. From where we walked behind, we could see not everyone shouted with joy, not everyone welcomed him, for there were the temple priests, watching, a look of disapproval on their faces, a look of anger, a look of hatred. They didn't like Jesus. They feared his popularity with the people. They didn't like what he said about the hypocrisy of their actions, that they worked from the law, not from the love of God, and they were already looking for a way to bring him down. And they watched. The disciples had gone on ahead and found somewhere where we would share the Passover. And we settled in, and Jesus did what he always did. He went to the synagogue, he preached, he healed the sick, he told parables. And he said that someone would betray him and he would be crucified. Is this another parable? Is this like a symbolic story he's telling us? Because who would betray the man we all loved? Betray him on what grounds? He had never done anything wrong. And only the Romans were allowed to crucify. And so there was no reason for them to crucify Jesus, a prophet, a man of God. And then, on the first night when we broke the unleavened bread, preparing for Passover, Jesus again, at the dinner table, he said that one of us would betray him, one of his inner circle. And everyone protested, myself included, but Rabbi, we love you, we would never betray you. And he was sitting next to Peter, and he said something to Peter, and then he looked across at Judas, and they both dipped their bread into the bowl at the same time. And he raised his eyes to Judas and sent him off somewhere. Judas rose up and left. And we carried on with our meal. And Jesus took the bread and he broke it. And he told us to always do this in remembrance of him. And he took a cup of wine and he shared it amongst us. And again he said, we must do this in remembrance of him. And the mood was quite somber. We weren't quite sure what was happening, but there was something serious. And we sang some beautiful hymns, and then Jesus went off with his men friends up to Gethsemane, which they're just across the Kishon Valley, and they often did that when we were in the city to pray. We cleaned up and went to bed. And later that night I was woken from a deep sleep by the sound of banging. And I got up to him to see what was going on, and it was Andrew. He was shaking. His pale face was covered in a sheen of sweat, and there was fear all over him. And he said that while they were in the garden, Jesus had gone off to pray, and they'd fallen asleep, and Jesus had come back, and then they'd fallen asleep again, and they'd woken to be surrounded by temple guards, armed temple guards, led by Judas. Judas had walked up to Jesus and pointed him out by kissing him on the cheek. Ultimate betrayal. And the temple guards had arrested our Lord and taken him off to the temple on grounds of blasphemy, right now before Passover. Mary, Jesus' mother, was there, and she'd come out of her room and she just started to cry. And Andrew held her in his arms, but I couldn't sit there and wait. I grabbed my outer coat and I ran down to the temple to see if I could find out what was happening. How could this be happening? Everything Jesus had said about leaving us, about being betrayed, about being crucified, could this really be real? Could this actually be happening right now? There was a crowd gathering outside the temple, but we couldn't see what was going on. The man next to me muttered something about it was really unorthodox to be calling for a meeting at night. We could see nothing. We could hear nothing. So I waited. There was no point going home. There was no ways I was going to sleep anyway. And at first light of dawn, the temple guards opened the gate, and they ushered out Jesus with his hands bound like a criminal. The crowd surged forward to see, and suddenly that volatile crowd was shouting and yelling, and there was an aggression and an anger amongst the people. And I was carried along all the way to Herod's palace. They were taking Jesus to see the governor, Pontius Pilate, because only a Roman could call for the death sentence. And that's what the priests wanted. They wanted Jesus dead. When we got outside the palace, they called for the Romans to come out because the priests couldn't go in or it would defile them and they would not be able to take part in Passover. And so although I'd been pushed to the back, I could still hear everything that was going on. And the crowd was volatile and loud, and everyone was shouting and yelling, and there was noise and a horrible feeling within the crowd of frenzy, of bloodlust. And then Pilate came out. The soldiers quickly quietened the crowd with a few heavy-handed shoves and hits. And then I could see Jesus. Well, I could see his back, standing straight and tall, his head still up, and his hands tied. He said nothing. And the priests made their case. They said how Jesus had stirred up the crowd and it was blasphemy for him to say he was the Son of God, and they wanted him dead, and nothing less would do. And Pilate said, but this is an internal thing. It's got nothing to do with me. And then a messenger came through from the palace to say from his wife that she'd had a dream of Jesus, and he was an innocent man, and Pilate must have nothing to do with this. But the priests continued to shout their arguments, to say that it was blasphemy and that if he called King of the Jews, he would unsettle the whole province. And the people shouted along with. Those same people who had shouted, "Hail Jesus, King of the Jews," waved palms before him, now called for his blood. And I watched in horror, my heart sinking. How could this be happening? And then Pilate stood up and he said, all right, enough. At Passover, he always released a prisoner as part of the celebration. And he said, couldn't he release Jesus as part of the celebration for Passover? You know, that crowd asked for Barabbas, a murderer, in place of Jesus. I sank to the floor as Pilate literally washed his hands of the affair and ordered for Jesus to be lashed and crucified. My knees buckled and I fell to the floor, the crowd pushing against me as people bayed and yelled. I couldn't believe this was happening. How did we go from King of the Jews to crucified? The fickle crowd screamed and yelled, and I felt an arm go around my shoulders, and it was Joanne. She said to me, come, we need to go. They've taken him inside. There's nothing more you can do, Mary. We need to get out of here. It's not safe. And we stumbled back to the room the disciples had found, and we walked in, and there was the cushion where he'd sat. So short a time ago, breaking bread with us, washing the disciples' feet in service. And now he was to be crucified like a common criminal by the Romans. It was beyond belief. The next morning, his mother Mary and myself and Suzanne, we headed down to the temple to find out what was happening. We couldn't find any of the men. I don't know where they had gone. As we got down there, we heard crucifixion would take place today at 3 o'clock on Golgotha. They wanted it done and dusted before Sabbath. And we stood in the road, and we saw them bring out the condemned men. And Mary turned her face into my shoulder and she wept. Her whole body shook as a mother's heart broke. For when Jesus came past us, he was broken. There was blood dripping from the way they had lashed his back. Couldn't even recognize his face. They'd beaten him so much. They'd ripped out his beard, and his body was bruised. He stumbled as he passed us. One of the Roman soldiers grabbed a man from the crowd and told him to carry the cross for Jesus, and we could do nothing but stumble behind him, all the way up onto Golgotha. Mary turned her face away as they stripped him, and they nailed our Lord's hands and feet to that cross and raised it up, with a sign above it. It said, King of the Jews. John appeared beside us, and with his arms around us, he helped us to get right down to the base of the cross, telling the soldiers that this was Jesus' mother. There was nothing we could do. We stood and watched in horror as the crowd screamed and jeered, and the soldiers gambled for his clothes. And Jesus looked down and he said, Lord, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Mary's hand was in mine. Our knuckles were white. To watch this agony of someone you love, who doesn't deserve this. And Jesus, from up there, from that place of torment, he looked down, he looked at John, he told him to take care of Mary, that he was to look after her like a mother. Even at that time, thinking about this. A while later, we saw him turn and say something to the man on the cross next to him. The agony. From where I stood, I could see each breath. He would have to drag himself up using his feet with those nails to get air into his lungs. And then as he exhaled, he'd let go, and the weight would fall onto his shattered wrists. Every breath in agony. I could see the thorns digging into his skull with trickles of blood running down his face. And my heart was breaking. It was like the worst nightmare you could ever live through, but it was real. And then the sky went dark, as if the very earth, the very creation mourned what was happening. People began to be afraid. And 3 hours later, 3 hours of listening to that agonized breath, of weeping, of wishing it would just end. Our Lord, our Rabbi, shouted out in absolute agony, my God, why have you forsaken me? And shortly after, he said, into your hands I commit my spirit. And he died. He was gone. The tortured breathing was over. He hung limp against the bounds. His head hung down, and the soldier came and pierced his side as Mary fell on her knees in anguish, with John's arm around her, his face wet with tears. And I was numb. I saw the water fly out of his side as they pierced him. I heard the centurion who was in charge look up and say this man was innocent. Too late now. And the crowd who had jeered and bayed, a fickle crowd, now they left, beating their breasts in mourning. And we watched as the soldiers pushed down the cross, and it landed with a thunk against the blood-soaked earth. And we saw them pull the nails out. They were about to drag Jesus' body away to the communal grave when Joseph of Arimathea arrived, a wealthy man from the city. And he told Mary that he would give Jesus his private tomb. It was new. It had never been used. And so we followed him to the tomb with Jesus' body. And there we started to lay it out. And we washed that broken flesh, and our heart was numb. It couldn't be. And we wrapped it in the linen that Joseph had provided. And then we had to leave because Sabbath was coming. And the men rolled a big stone across the entrance. And our small broken band went home, wrecked. A vision of horror in our eyes, the smell of death in our lungs. John was almost carrying Mary. She was inconsolable. If my pain as his friend was great, his mother's pain beyond fathoming. When we got back up to the room, we walked in, and it was almost unbelievable that in such a short time so much horror had occurred. And I went and sat down where he had sat just the other day and broken bread with us. And I broke I cried and cried and cried, for my Lord was gone. Our rabbi, who'd been nothing but good and kind and righteous, was dead, and a cruel and vicious death. And nothing would ever bring joy again. Nothing was worth living for. What was the point? And I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could just see the agony and hear that breathing and know that pain of watching him die. Eventually, I must have cried myself to sleep, for we woke the next morning, and one of the disciples had come back and was saying that at the moment Jesus died, the curtain in the temple had torn into the Holy of Holies. And people who had died before had risen from the dead and walked into Jerusalem. He didn't care. Jesus was gone. There's no point in living. Just get through the Sabbath so we could finish the rituals. And on the third day, Mary, the mother of James, and myself, we packed the last incense and we went to complete the dressing on the body. And as we walked, the dust rose up in puffs around our ankles, and the air was still quite chilly. We were wondering if the soldiers who'd been posted outside the tomb to stop us stealing the body would help us open it. And when we got there, stopped in astonishment. We dropped what we carried in the sand and ran, for the tomb was open, the stone had been rolled already. And when we ran in, Jesus' body was gone. How could they do this? What more could they do? Why? Had they not done enough? We turned and ran back to tell the disciples, and Peter and one of the others came back with me, and yes, the tomb was empty. And when we went in, there where he had lain on the shelf was the wrapping we'd wrapped him in, with the headpiece folded on the side. The men left to go back to the room. I couldn't. I didn't think I could walk. I leant against the outside of the tomb, my heart breaking. It was too much. And then I glanced once more into the tomb, and there were two men sitting on the tomb, and they asked me why I was crying. And I said, "They've taken my Lord. I don't know where he is." And then I felt a presence behind me, and it looked like one of the gardeners or the caretakers. And he said, "Woman, why do you cry?" I said, "They've taken my Lord. If you are one who took him, please tell me where he is." And then, he said my name. He said, "Mary." And I looked, and the tears dried, for there before me was my Lord. Our rabbi was alive. He was resurrected and alive. I don't know how, but there he stood before me. And he said to me, "Go, Mary, tell the others, for I am alive." And I ran with wings on my feet all the way back to the room and told them, "Don't mourn, Jesus is alive. He is risen from the dead and he is alive." And at first they didn't believe me. They thought I was so distraught I'd lost my mind. But Jesus came. Not once, not twice. For the next 40 days, he walked with us. He spoke with us. He ate with us. And he taught us. And he told us, "Go and tell the good news that my awful death on the cross was to wage war against sin. It was so that you could walk in relationship with me for the rest of forever. And you can call God Father, because I have made you righteous by what I have done." And I was there the day that he stood on the mount and he ascended into the sky. And he told us to come back here to Jerusalem and wait. And that's what we're doing. He said that the Holy Spirit would come and empower us so that we would be able to witness to the ends of the earth, to God's love and God's salvation and redemption plan for all of mankind. And here we wait. And now, the joy I have, inexplicable, unbelievable, all-consuming joy, because Jesus is alive. And nothing can take away the incredible gift that he's given to me. And as we approach Easter, this is my message to you. Jesus died just for you. He died so that you could walk in a relationship knowing him, so that you could call God Father and know his incredible, indescribable, unbelievable love. All you have to do is say yes. So God bless you this Easter, and I hope you enjoyed the story of Mary of Magdalene. Thank you for listening.